Hi, I'm Noah Mertz. I grew up in Needham not that long ago. My parents moved here for the schools and the proximity to Boston. Uh, no doubt it was a great place to grow up, but it also had its drawbacks, such as the intense pressure at the schools and also the lack of diversity. Uh, so I've went to college and moved around a lot, and since coming back to Needham for COVID, have had a lot of time to reflect and ask some big questions about the status quo. The George Floyd uprisings last summer were a big catalyst in the town, and a lot of people came together to form this movement called Equal Justice in Needham, which is working to learn about and confront the legacies of injustice that have shaped Needham into the town we know it to be today. So with Equal Justice in Needham, we are envisioning a more equal and just town, and we're taking those steps toward making it a reality through concrete policy change. If you're interested in learning more or joining in, you can visit our website, equaljusticeneedham.org. Today's show will be hosted by Gretchen Cook-Anderson, a Needham resident and town meeting member.
Hi, I'm Gretchen Cook-Anderson, and welcome to Moving Forward Together with Equal Justice Needham. Needham is a quintessential suburb full of beautiful single-family homes with yards and trees and picket fences. But how did it come to be that way? And how did the demographics come to skew wealthy and white? It turns out this was no accident and was actually the product of deliberate decisions made by the town. As Needham transitioned from a farm town to a more dense suburb in the first half of the 20th century, single-family zoning ensured that density would stay low and property values would stay high, while redlining and exclusionary covenants ensured that only white residents would be allowed to get loans and move into those homes. For the white middle class folks lucky enough to own homes in Needham, as their equity in their homes increased, so did their personal wealth, allowing them to pass on an inheritance to their kids, pay for college, and enjoy travel. Housing and schools are intrinsically tied. Higher property values means more tax revenue, and Needham has long prioritized the public schools as our #1 budget item, garnering a reputation as having one of the best and best funded education systems in the Commonwealth. However, the way that school funding works, anyone outside the district, as in anyone who doesn't live in Needham, is shut out from all of the resources we have hoarded here. To better explain how redlining built wealth for exclusively white Needham homeowners, we are starting off with a clip from Segregated by Design, a film based on the book The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein.
Today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans who, for the most part, were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases.
So I'd like to introduce a couple of wonderful panelists today who will help us with our deep dive with regard to housing in Needham and its history. Liam Kerr attended the Needham Public Schools and is a Needham resident, where he is raising his family. He is currently the Massachusetts State Director of Democrats for Education Reform and is an organizer with the advocacy group, which is statewide, Policy for Progress. And then we have Amanda Berman. Amanda is raising her family here in Needham as well. She is Director of Housing and Community Planning for the City of Newton. Thank you so much, Liam and Amanda, and we appreciate you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today. So a few questions. And this first question I'd love to direct to Liam, if you don't mind. Liam, as we just saw in that video, housing policies have been the primary cause of the segregated communities we find ourselves in. Can you give us a brief background on how Needham fits into this picture?
Yeah, and thank you so much for hosting this important conversation. It's something as a Needham native and Needham Public Schools graduate that definitely shakes me. And in that context, also nationally, of understanding that, you know, as you mentioned, Needham is a poster child of sorts for a suburb. We're also in many ways a poster child for why the Northeast and the North in general is actually more segregated than the South. And our history is closely intertwined with, you know, the small municipalities and towns that are celebrated as this birthplace of democracy, these small, highly independent and powerful governing bodies that are different from other parts of the country. And I think many people are shocked to learn that, you know, the Needham, Boston area is more segregated than most places in the South. And that's a top of a list we don't want to be on. And it's closely tied to many of the things we do prize. You know, our local public schools, our control that we have, as well as other local towns. And it's part of what's allowed us to, you know, have very high home prices and maintain control over that local housing policy.
Thank you. Yeah, but you know, when we look across the landscape of this town and its demographics, in your view, what's wrong with this picture? You know, what benefits could accrue to a more integrated Needham?
Yeah, and it's something that I've increasingly been talking about with my classmates that I went to elementary school with. I went to Mitchell Elementary School. I started in 1988, so that's, you know, about 3.5 decades after Brown v. Board, and we're about another 3.5 decades after that. And we had 0 Black students in our 5th grade class at a time when Boston Public Schools, which was, you know, for those who know where Mitchell is, it's, you know, a half mile to the Boston line. Boston Public Schools was about half Black students. Yeah. What the research shows is actually being in an integrated school environment benefits all children. And through the Policy for Progress initiative, we, you know, worked with a national think tank and also with a national progressive polling firm, and found that, you know, while people may underrate the level of segregation in our state and in our region, they do see really strong benefits from integration. And so this is a place where, you know, I think the residents of Greater Boston, the residents of Massachusetts, and the academic research really merge in understanding that integrated schools benefit all students. But it does take work. It's not just simply desegregation and not simply changing the numbers. You know, it does take a lot to foster true integration. And, you know, preferably that would be residential in addition to just school-based. Some of the data that I mentioned can be found at policyforprogress.org, the Commonwealth Fault Lines report that we put out in collaboration with a couple other groups. touches on Needham and Boston as having one of the most segregating school district boundaries in the country, which I think should be an important wake-up call for us as a community and as individuals.
And so in talking about the schools and, and thinking about the emphasis that, historically, this town has put on budgeting for our schools, how our schools attract residents to this town. Can you share a little bit more about the relationship between better schools and more housing choice?
It's the problem we all live with. And it's something that is, it's like asking a fish about water. Just feeling like residential and school segregation is something that we all just live with. And it can almost easily fade into the background, and something that needs to be, I think, surfaced and addressed to be taken on, and actually look at the statistics. When I moved back to Needham in 2015 and look back, and there was one Black kindergartner at Mitchell. And we think about the METCO program, which brings tremendous benefits. It also I think should make us all pause to say we're asking students of color to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and take a bus out to Needham. Other places in the country have done more kind of two-way integration. And when you think people say, I moved to Needham for the schools, that is, again, like the water, it's something that we're just used to. But what does that mean? I moved to Needham for the schools. Does that mean, I largely wanted my children going to school with people who, are from, increasingly master's degree holding households, or doctorate or law or other professional degree holding households, very high income, and isolated from the socioeconomic and racial diversity of many other public school districts. And I think it's worth pausing both individually and as a community. And it's something I, at a personal level, didn't do as much until right after, and getting woken up by it. Wow, things really haven't changed that much in 3.5 decades. The nature of segregation has changed. The subgroups have changed, but the kind of structural racism that feeds itself into our economic, housing, and education policy is still there. And I think I moved to Needham for the schools, or we attract people for the schools, is something that deserves really pausing and reflecting.
These are things that I reflect on too, as a Needham resident who happens to be a Needham resident of color. I was a child of the late 60s and 70s who actually integrated public schools. I was part of that movement to enforce Brown versus Board of Education. But even though it happened in the 50s, it was still a need to enforce Brown versus Board of Education, particularly in the South, partially where I grew up. And so I was among a group of children as a first grader who was then forced to integrate, bused to a school that was all white. And it is ironic that all these many years later, that housing segregation and school segregation are still something that many of our communities are contending with and confronting and trying to find solutions to. So, and thank you very much, Liam. So I want to turn to Amanda, if we could. If we accept that more housing choice would be good for Needham. So let's say that the majority of residents in Needham, are really aboard with this notion and this desire. So if we accept that housing choice would be good for Needham, what are some of the things that our town could be doing, some tangible things that we could be doing to move us toward a more equitable and just community?
Yeah. Well, I just want to say, I really loved your opening remarks, Gretchen. I think that you said some really powerful things, and then Liam picked up so perfectly on this conversation and how it is so intertwined. But, it pains me to think that we even have to talk about, school integration and METCO and busing children, when really, like, at the base level, why are we not just more integrated as a community? Why are we looking at, over 80% white population here in Needham, which of course is going to mean that our schools are majority white and that we have to use these kind of Band-Aid measures of, METGO and bringing children of color and lower economic means into our schools. And as Liam said, these poor kids getting up at 5 a.m. Let's just start at the core, which is our communities for hundreds of years and even today continue to be incredibly segregated for many reasons, right? And I think, as Liam said, we're all kind of trying to come to grips with this, and it is really, it's hard for me as an urban planner and someone who is focused on affordable housing and equitable planning and development. I often have pause and like, wait, why did I move to a town that's exactly like where I grew up in central Pennsylvania, where everyone's white and, great schools and all that? That's fine, but we need to open up, as you said, open up our housing opportunity and choices so that others who aren't white, wealthy, with master's degrees can also benefit these incredible locations. Because I think it isn't just the schools. I mean, for me, it's sidewalks. Like, what an amazing amenity that our town has sidewalks where it's safe to walk. Not everywhere, but there are so many towns that don't have sidewalks, of a great downtown, beautiful parks, playgrounds, incredible access to public transportation. I mean, it's unbelievable how many stops we have on the commuter rail, right? And then next to Newton, which has access to the T, et cetera. We're right along the freeway system. I mean, the amenities that we have in our town are endless. And we are continuing to create, modern day redlining still with our zoning bylaws. And so what is one of the best things we could do as a town to open up opportunity and create more access? We need to change our zoning. It's extremely problematic that such a large portion of our town is single family only zoning, because again, we're perpetuating the racial and economic segregation that has been going on here for years and years and years, and not just here. I mean, this is, again, a problem across the country and even across the world in a way. But why does so many of the lots in town have to be single family only? If we can add to our housing supply, it's a supply demand kind of simple concept. We need to add to our housing supply, and that is not a bad thing. If we create more housing, a little bit denser housing opportunity, this town is not going to change overnight and become a horrible place to live. And even if it means a little more traffic, that's something we all, as privileged, white, somewhat wealthier people, I think we can deal with that. I think that's something that maybe a burden we can take on to allow for greater housing opportunity. And I think it's these simple concepts that we need, to talk about. Is it really a problem if 3 more kids enter a grade every year in a new school? Is that going to ruin my child's education? Liam's the expert here. I would be surprised if he said, yes, that's going to ruin your child's education. So let's open up our schools. Let's open up our towns. So first and foremost, we need to look at our zoning. It is creating, continual barriers, perpetuating the racial segregation. It's a modern form of redlining, and it has to change. So with the Muzzy site, it really upset me to hear so much conversation about, but the increase in traffic, but the, too many kids in our school. These are problems that can be solved. These are development mitigation challenges that are no-brainers. This happens every day around the world. Towns and cities are really, they're these living, breathing entities. They change, they expand, they contract, they build up, they come down. There's more traffic, there's more public transportation, etc. We have to be able to adapt. And so it really, was hard and is hard still to see such opposition to a rezoning of an underutilized parcel that is in an amazing location for more housing. So The housing group of Equal Justice in Needham put forth amendments to ask the planning board to remove the cap on the number of units that was set at that site. I think, our feeling was that it really sends the wrong message that we're only okay with so much housing. We're only okay with so much density. And it also sends a message to the development community that, we kind of want change, but not really. And we're actually less concerned about whether a project is financially feasible and can actually happen here. We need the housing. We need it here in Needham. We need it in the region, and it's our obligation. April is Fair Housing Month. 53 years ago on April 11th, the Fair Housing Act was signed into law, and this was just days after Martin Luther King was assassinated. So racial justice and fair housing and affordable housing are inextricably linked, and we need to really be talking about that in a very open way in a community like Needham. It is our obligation as a town. We receive federal funds. We have to affirmatively further fair housing. What does that mean? It means reducing the barriers and impediments that exist to allowing for more affordable housing opportunity for lower income people. And in this region in particular, a lot of people of color, particularly Black and Hispanic, have much lower incomes than whites. So if we're not creating affordable housing, we're not necessarily going to see true integration and greater racial equity in Needham.
I think the clarity around socioeconomic diversity does not equal racial diversity.
Correct.
In both
Absolutely.
directions. And there's a obstacle there beyond affordability. I think it's so important.
Here's the statistic, right? That proves that. The median household income in Needham of white non-Latinx, $153,000. For Black households, $55,000. So what is that telling you? As you're saying, affluent, Black households are not choosing Needham.
It's not just about socioeconomic diversity. It's about the messaging a community is putting out into the local area about who is welcome here. And so, beyond the issues of accessibility and zoning and lending practices and so forth, we're also talking about what message is a community sending out to the wider area about who is welcome, who we want as our neighbors and our friends, and the children who are hanging out in our homes who are friends of our children. That's what we need to, if we truly believe as a community that we want to be more inclusive, that we want to be more integrated, then we all have a job to do. As every single resident in this town has a job to do to send that message out into the area. I would also add that I think it's also an obligation of our business community as well to get more involved in equity and inclusion in housing with regard to lending as well. This is another area that historically has been part of segregation in various communities, not only here in Massachusetts, but around the country. So I would also call on our business community in Needham as well to really think about how it can contribute to greater equity and inclusion in housing, and therefore the makeup of our wonderful town.
Because I know I did a lot of talking about what we're not doing and what's been done wrong. Let's give a shout out to Marcus and Lakshmi for being the first people of color elected to our select board. And I think I was just thinking about the messaging. I would like to think that has sent a really positive message throughout the region that look at what Needham can do. We can support these two wonderful candidates who happen to be people of color and put them towards the top of the ranks of our political leadership and support their efforts to, really focus on increased diversity and equity and all of that.
Absolutely. That was a great point, Amanda, because I think we've got to find ways to cheer ourselves on in the work that we're doing. So, because it's not all bad news, there's a lot of good news out there about what this community is doing. And I think for me, that's one of the reasons why I've grown to love the community, because I know that there are people who are, really in the trenches of making change here, both evolutionary and revolutionary change, positive change in this town. And I just think that, yes, the results of our recent local election really does send a strong signal about who we are right now. So thank you very much. I want to close with just a few thoughts, if we can. And just, I'm kind of talking directly to Needham friends and neighbors. We have the ability to create an even richer community, richer on a number of levels, right? By advocating for more inclusive housing policy and practice. For me, this is a deeply personal topic. My husband and I experienced housing discrimination prior to moving to Massachusetts through predatory lending practices as recently as 2012. We were plaintiffs in the largest class action lawsuit against Bank of America for discriminatory lending. What's even more important to know is that despite the bank settling with hundreds of Black and brown customers, we will never recover most of our wealth lost due to that case of systemic racism. Over $100,000 in my case. This is not small beans. Okay. Let's work together to make instances like this one and others a thing of the past. And amazing inclusive communities a huge part of our future. Thank you for joining us for this installment of Moving Forward Together. I'd like to ask that we hear from you. We would love to hear from you at Moving Forward Together. Please check out our website. We have a really good poll there that we'll make available for you after this particular segment. We'd like to hear your thoughts on how we can solve problems around racial exclusion and housing discrimination here in our town so that we can have a more equitable and inclusive community. That poll will take you just a few minutes, but the impact of hearing from you would be powerful. So everyone, I would really like to thank Liam Kerr and Amanda Berman for joining us today for this particular segment. Your views and your experiences and your opinions, are really valuable to this conversation. Thank you again for joining us for this segment, and we'll see you again.